Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you may be tuning in from. It's both an honor and a pleasure to be taking part in this session. I've had the good fortune of being in conversation with Leo well over a year now and had the opportunity to break bread with him in London last December. So it's especially meaningful to be sharing this platform with him. And I've been enjoying immensely reading Alberto's work in the last few days in anticipation of this event. I look forward to hearing his work soon. One of the questions we were asked in advance was, what LGBTQ poets serve as role models for your literary work? It's in the spirit of that question that I want to begin and end my reading by sharing a poem by two poets who are no longer with us in the flesh, but very much with me in spirit. This first piece is by the late Chicano poet, Francisco X. Alarcon. The first time I heard this poem, it was from an unpublished manuscript. It went on to be published in a dual language book called Cuerpo en Llamas, Body in Flames, for which I served as the sole translator. The name of the poem in Spanish is El otro día me encontré a García Lorca. Lo reconocí por el moño, los labios, los ojos olivos. Lloraban guitarras y bailaba flamenco la tarde. De pronto se paró, vino directo a mi mesa y me plantó un beso como sol andaluz en mi boca. And here is my English version of the piece. The other day, I ran into Garcia Lorca. I spotted him, the slim bow tie, those lips, those eyes, olive-colored. Guitars wept while the day kicked up its heels. Abrupt, he stood, sauntered straight to my table. His mouth, como sol andaluz, met my lips. The first piece of my own that I'd like to share with you is from my first book, Puerta del Sol, which gathers work I wrote during the 10 years I lived in Spain. In fact, there's a reference to a village on the Mediterranean coast, just south of Barcelona, named Sitges. But the poem begins and ends in my native Northern California, first on the UC Berkeley campus, where one summer I took an intensive course in French. The poem has an epigraph, a phrase uttered by my French teacher, à la belle étoile, which translates roughly as out in the open, under the stars. And the poem ends at the Russian River, which is north of San Francisco in Sonoma County. The poem is operating on two fronts. On the one hand, it's attempting to depict how a long-buried memory can sometimes be dislodged and recalled by an unplanned sensory experience. In this case, hearing that phrase, à la belle étoile. And in another sense, especially in the end, the poem, I think, tries to capture a young person's first feelings with desire. Bridge over Strawberry Creek, à la belle étoile. The path off the west crescent that turns briefly into the wooden footbridge, and above it a canopy of leaves, crossed and recrossed through the years, never pausing once for a peek over the edge until now. The surface blooming with concentric rings. It's beginning to rain. Or water striders skating around a stagnant section of the creek. And when I chose my place that morning at the open window, redwoods framed against June's day blue, it wasn't the wind in the trees which, if I closed my eyes, had me on a balcony in Sitges those summer nights, listening to the Mediterranean breathe, but rather the fact of her voice, Madame Boucher's meaning and sound meshing in a phrase. I'm 12 and lying on a bed of chipped wood, warm, snug in the bag, facing the stars, my head sifting the day. A morning hike, a dip in the Russian River before lunch, before the doorless stalls, the dank cement on the soles of my feet, the towels, the soap, the rich lather lacing his chest. The next piece is from my second book, Glow of Our Sweat, and it's a sonnet. Its rhyme scheme is borrowed by a former teacher, from a former teacher I had many years ago, and it's set in Madrid, Spain. And there is a reference to another coastal place, in this case in the north of Spain, in the Basque country. I used the Basque name for San Sebastian, Donostia. And there's also toward the end a reference to a river in Ireland, the Liffey, which runs through Dublin. And lastly, there's an allusion to the Spanish custom of abandoning their interior cities during the month of August and heading for the coast, that time of year when a good portion of the population is on vacation, including small businesses. Your voice. Amazing the mood it's put me in. And the sky's tint at this hour, out on my own, occasional hum or zip of a car. August, the summer month, half the city splashes about the Mediterranean or north. The beach at Donostia, a jewel. It's Paseo, the lip of a shell to walk. It's hearing you what really pulls me in, soft, this interior punch, recalling the sheen of your brow. We talk with our limbs, the Liffey below. Have lunch, relived this evening on the phone, the pitch of your Dublin tone. My next two pieces are from the new book, After Rubén, which was released last May. The Rubén of the title, of course, is the Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío, who will figure more in the next poem. Though this piece references a living poet in the title, after fragments of Juan Felipe Herrera, the great Chicano poet and former US poet laureate. The poem is in two parts, but I'll be sharing part 2 today, which is subtitled Eyes, as in our organs for sight. In some regards, it continues this motif of finding ourselves at the shore of a body of water. After fragments of Juan Felipe Herrera, part 2, Eyes. Here I am again, attempting to swim, my breaststroke reduced to rubble after decades of sifting. The years, I hadn't noticed how flabby my arms had become, giggling in the moonlight, a distant memory. Summer nights we sneaked out, down to that corner of the beach no one spoke of openly. Side by side, we would laugh and lick, giving new meaning to a phrase, slip of the tongue, and no buttons to undo, no shirts to strain to see through, the rags of our clothes in a heap back at the bungalow. Instead, the wet sand films our arms our hands, our legs, as we cross easily the sea of our gaze. One of the aspects of After Rubén, as I've said at recent readings, is that there are 10 poems that are inspired by the original Spanish language poems of Rubén Darío. The piece I'm going to read to you now is inspired by a Darío sonnet titled De Invierno. It's not a translation per se. I'll say more about the backstory of this particular poem during our discussion. But for now, let me just say that an angora is the name of a long-haired domesticated rabbit. And there is also a reference to someone named Amado, which would be the great Mexican poet Amado Nervo. Winter hours. Look at him curled in a large plush chair, wrapped in sable fur, fireplace glowing just beyond, the angora nosing the fabric of his shirt, a porcelain vase beside the folding screen draped with silk, his eyes subtle filters allowing sleep to seep through. He enters in silence, takes off his gray coat, pecks the slender rose of his face, the fleur de lis. Amado wakes, smiles, snow general over París. After Rubén Darío's De Invierno. And this final piece, which is also from my second book, is the last poem I want to share before I conclude with a piece by another departed LGBTQ mentor. It's a brief, fairly straightforward poem titled Earplugs, as in those objects we sometimes put in our ears to help cancel out unwanted noise. Though here, the earplugs in question seem to provoke another kind of listening, another kind of sound. Earplugs. Putty globes, thumbs press into place, drifting to sleep beside you for the first time, trying to, your seemingly distant, muffled snore, more than heard, felt at intervals, and in between, interior sound of my breathing, my heart. I was immensely fortuitous during my years at UC Berkeley in the mid-'80s in terms of who I was able to study poetry with. One of my mentors back then never tired of sharing with his students the conviction that a poem is not a fully realized work of art until it is uttered aloud by someone other than its author. It's in that spirit that I share a poem with you with another UC Berkeley mentor, the late British-born poet Tom Gunn. It's from his book, The Man with Night Sweats, which was published in 1982. And this poem is the very first poem in the book. And with this, I'll close. The Hug. It was your birthday. We had drunk and dined half of the night with our old friend, who'd showed us in the end to a bed I reached in one drunk stride. Already, I lay snug and drowsy with the wine, dozed on one side. I dozed. I slept. My sleep broke on a hug suddenly, from behind, in which the full lengths of our bodies pressed, your instep to my heel, my shoulder blades against your chest. It was not sex, but I could feel the whole strength of your body set or braced to mine and locking me to you, as if we were still 22 when our grand passion had not yet become familial. My quick sleep had deleted all of intervening time and place. I only knew the stay of your secure, firm, dry embrace. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Francisco. Qué maravilla. Let's just move straight over to Leo. Leo, you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you, Willy, and thank you, Francisco, for an amazing performance, amazing reading. I'm delighted to be here to join you all. I'm in Deal in Kent, in the UK. I'm originally from Buenos Aires, from Argentina. And I'm going to be reading today a series of poems that are going to be part of my next collection coming out next year in June. But first, and in the spirit of Francisco, I will read a poem by one of my mentors. I never met him. His name is Jorge Eduardo Eyelson. He's a Peruvian poet and also an artist. I admired his work very much, and I've been involved with his work for many years. I translated his work into English many times. So the poem I'm going to read is called Ceremonia Solitaria en Compañía de tu Cuerpo. Penetro tu cuerpo de carne, penetro, me hundo entre tu lengua y tu mirada pura. Primero con mis ojos, con mi corazón, con mis labios, luego con mi soledad, con mis huesos, con mi glande. Entro y salgo de tu cuerpo como si fuera un espejo. Atravieso pelos y quejidos. No sé cuál es tu piel y cuál la mía, cuál mi esqueleto y cuál el tuyo. Tu sangre brilla en mis arterias, semejante a un lucero. Mis brazos y tus brazos son los brazos de una estrella que se multiplica y que nos llena de ternura. Somos un animal que se enamora, mitad ceniza, mitad latido, un puñado de tierra que respira, de incandescentes materias, que jadean y que gozan, y que jamás reposan. My next poem is called Hectoring. About the boy's new fluorescent bracelet. How wrong to display those fancy things. The old man talked as if he'd been in the army. You must only wear men's things, he said. A wristwatch, a wedding ring, and watch it. Your abuelo's flesh, blood, faggot? Never. The TV soap opera, Mujer de Nadie, Nobody's Woman. A porteña maid in love with her boss's son. He, a Latino stud. She laid with him in the attic. Later found out they were cousins. The old man watched intently. His mate, a heavy kettle on a stand, the water almost boiling. Behind him, the old woman cooked lunch for their grandchild. A fat shadow on a spotless lino floor. On a high-up shelf at the old man's garage, a photo of him as a teenager, perhaps during Carnival or a theatre soiree, made up as Pierrot with his silk pantaloons, an oversized wig with curls, a hat with 3 large pompons. In front of a window, in an opulent house. He was embracing Harlequin, who'd held a Spanish guitar. They seemed relaxed in each other's arms. My next poem is a sequence called Table Variations. 1. Oval table. Profane, four-legged thing, a holy place of gatherings, father, mother, 3 kids, a ghost, eating asado, Sunday mass, barbecue, sins familiar, sins scattered all over the old checkered tablecloth. Pray, one day you'll have a family like this. All these traditions will pass on to you. Pray, this broken table now dies slowly, now lies alone in a tool shed somewhere south. High altar. And there is an epigraph by Genesis. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. A piece of furniture with a flat top and 1 or more legs, providing a level surface for eating, writing, of us kids, and father still preaching, we're both alike, you, my son, I will make you love every woman, mujeriego, like dad, cracked, broken legs, or so he says. This life, unknown to you, so apart, tell us, oh, why you feel a man hidden inside, liar, you love hairy legs, so familiar, or so he says. 3. A family ceremony. And she laid the table, and she asked everyone to sit around, and she prayed with her eyes shut, and she thought we prayed with her, and he looked at her and then looked at me looking at him, and warm blood overspilled the chopping board, and the knife went in, and I didn't want to see, and he said to me, don't be so gay, no seas maricón. And I looked at my empty plate and pressed my hands under the table and ate my words, and they tasted like burnt barbecue. And mother thanked the Lord with her eyes shut, and we thanked the Lord after her. My next poem is called Echo, and it's a mistranslation after Ovid. A lovely boy, he surely dies. A dubious mother. Suspense, suspense. He on the verge of man, in vain, perhaps in pain, a male friend caresses. Once in the woods, he pursues him or else. Echo describes Echo. He seeks his face, another face, and lives in the covert of woods, caves, dark abodes, and there he hears himself, a sounding skeleton, bereft of bones, vignettes, yet only a voice remains, nothing left. His words involts, distorts, it doubles up every single sound. It replies to whoever calls his name. My next poem is called The Fall, and it's a poem that is divided in two sections. It's a mirror poem. So the first section is replicated in the second, sort of backwards, and you will see. The Fall, para Pablo. Be kind to me, you said to the oval mirror, and I followed through the palm-infested night, a simple path reflected simply, brothers alike, brothers. Kiss is un beso to a kiss. Our twin images akin, our mirror divided and announced. Can you hear us? Opened to a subtropical void that's only us going carnivorous. Flowers slowly unpicked with symmetrical hands. Into the light we plunged down the cracks. We didn't have to fall. Listen to our tongues, how we met, how we stayed as one, how we spent the first night together, how we met, how we stayed as one, how we spent the first night together, how we listened to our tongues. We didn't have to fall down the cracks. We plunged into the light with symmetrical hands, slowly unpicked carnivorous flowers. That's only us going to a subtropical void. Can you hear us? Opened mirror, divided and announced. Our twin images akin. Our kiss is un beso to a kiss. Brothers alike brothers. A simple path reflected simply through the palm-infested night. And I followed, you said to the oval mirror, be kind to me. My next poem is from my first book, Un lugar propio. It's a very short poem. And it's dedicated as well to Pablo. Find it here. Los ojos de Pablo. El miedo a los cíclopes cuando toma vino de la copa de los dioses. Tierra purpurina, órbitas en anillos manchados. Una tarde que pasamos de forma inconsecuente. Hay cierta negrura en las memorias muertas y puntos. Hay iluminaciones. Cuando él despierta, el sol abre su boca para dejar entrar aire. My last poem before the poem I'm going to read from my mentor is called Ballad of a Happy Immigrant. And that is going to be the title of my next book. So, Ballad of a Happy Immigrant after Louis MacNeice. In the beginning, there was a garden and a boy who counted ants, dug for bulbs. All these he enjoyed. Come back a man or never come. Father agrees the Peugeot is blasting a radio of 80s techno on. Learn. One day you will need to know. Come back a man or never come. The spaniel dog under the kitchen table, the endless heat, the dusty sparrows on hanging cables. Come back a man or never come. Mothers, palm leaves, dresses, hair sandals, The day she left, they took her things. I lit a candle. Come back a man or never come. Father dressed younger and then remarried. After a loved, sweet wife, he quickly buried. Come back a man or never come. We moved 2 times from south to north. Some things we took, some we forgot. Come back a man or never come. My sisters shared a fuchsia room, their ploys. I found a corner where I hid my joys. Come back a man or never come. I went on trains to school and back. At home, the fights, burned steaks, news cracks. Come back a man or never come. The night I left, I gave some clues. Look out for me, my ties, my shoes. Come back a man or never come. The shared old flat in Naysborough Court, 6 a room, a kitchenette, my home of sorts. Come back a man or never come. My lousy English searched out for words, though found I still could communicate with words. Come back a man or never come. I met few men, went out to clubs, some were smarter than others, and one night at the NFT, I met the artist. Come back a man or never come. The daily trips to Hampstead Heath, late coffees in Soho, we kissed in Russell Square. A builder shouted, "You too, homers." Come back a man or never come. We moved together by the flower market, our tiny flat on Columbia Road. A new life had started. Come back a man or never come. Long distance phone calls, Dad and his orchids, his health, his lungs, the chats more morbid. Come back a man or never come. I nurse him a week, his bloody coughs, and as he died, my London flight took off. Come back a man or never come. In Seaside Deal, we found some peace. You drew too late. I wrote cinquains, planted dwarf trees. Come back a man or never come. Now I swim and swim, come sun or hail, the sea, my friend, my foe, this holy grail. Come back a man or never come. And if they ask, is this your home? I say, well, yes, at least I hope. Come back a man or never come. And to finish, I'm going to read a poem by another mentor of mine. Again, I never met him. His name is Neto Palonger. He's an Argentine. He was an Argentinian writer and poet, and he lived in Brazil. He was from Argentina, and as well as Ailson, both they lived abroad. They lived as exiles in different countries. So I immediately became very attached to their writing and experiences. And also I very much like Palonger's use of language, the way that he plays with words and creates sounds, and it's very Baroque. So I'm going to read a very Baroque poem, very experimental, quite short, and very camp. It's called Opus Jopo. En el condón del jopo engominado, arisco, mecha o franja de sombras en la metáfora que avanza, sobra sobre el condón del jopo la mirada que acecha despeinarlo, rodar la redecilla en las guedejas, un púbico pudor irresistible, tieso en la gosma del spray, la goma libidinizada, esa saeta de la mata en el enroque de la fima, el gime, el fimoteo, denuedo de las uñas en el mechón de grima, guedeja en muslos, enroscada, húmedo pelo, espesor de las cejas en lo ebúneo, cobrizo, un jaloneo de papilas en los estrechos del olor jugoso, el ronroneo de los labios ante las curvas, cuevas, su salitre, el tartaleo de la transpiración, sudores finos atascaban el muslo en su rulo, jalean las aras, sus aros de peltre, jadeo lúcido, luminiscente en el rebote de las ligas, en la película infusa, taza de té en los bordes del reboque. La trama en ese punto, en la lisura de ese cascabel serpeante, de esa rima de jade en los jabones de los pies. Melecas, masca en el crisar de los penachos, la promesa de un guante. Thank you very much.
Leo, desde Inglaterra, all the way to Utah or Salvador, o donde estás. Thank you so much, Leo. That was increíble. Alberto, you ready? ¿Listo?
Sí. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation, Willy. I am glad to be with you, with Francisco and Leo. I want to begin with a poem by Ricardo Lindo. He's a Salvadoran poet, and he died a few years ago. And in 2004, he released this, not book, but a piece of art itself. It's called Injuries or Injurias. No, but it'd be like insults in English, I guess. And the poem is called Danza, Dance. Viejas damas hipócritas danzaban por los prados, vestidas de encarnadas, áureas sedas y armiños, con largos, largos mantos de cola de reptil. Gordas, viejas, hipócritas, secas, viejas, hipócritas, danzaban, murmurando entre sí con risitas malévolas, minimizándome, soltando piedrezuelas a mi paso y añadiendo con voz fingida de flautín, es que nosotras te queremos tanto. Tintineaban sus collares encantadores, con chirridos de goznes de prisión, sus pelucas fosforescentes flotando al viento, graznaban cancioncillas con un agrio chillido, danzaban por los prados su delicada danza, pues sus muchos dineros y alta alcurnia no les permitirían en las ajenas vidas entrometerse para soltar graciosos chistecitos ridículos, pues aquel es gay, no podrían ellas, por un ratito al menos, ser vulgares, y por ello danzaban las damas en el prado, tan delicadas ellas, tan gentiles. Ricardo Lindo. Voy a hacer un recorrido por mis libros, con un poema o dos en cada uno. El velero. Me gusta contemplar mi piel desnuda, bañándose en el río, irresistible, palparla con mi ejército invencible de dedos que me bajan la bermuda. Piel silenciosa y tibia, siempre aguda, mientras yo la recorro así flexible, con cosquilleo en celo incontenible, bajo el vaivén del agua que me escuda. Yo navego desnudo en este río y me gozo con cada miembro mío palpado amenamente por completo. Del más fino cabello hasta las plantas, yo te amo, cuerpo mío, que me encantas, y es mi cómplice, el río, en el secreto. Bueno, when I was bathing in the river, someone was looking at me. And that was Walt Whitman. This poem is to Walt Whitman. Compañero. Bello pastor del cántico liberto, silvestre voz feliz del verso crudo, también adoro al hombre que desnudo nada en el río con latido abierto. También sé que me adoras y lo advierto en tu insondable carne que a menudo está tumbada sobre el pasto mudo viendo nadar mi cuerpo descubierto. Ah, compañero, abraza mi locura, yo abrazo tus caderas y cintura que libres sin cesar, como cualquiera, se entregan al placer desenfrenadas. Amante de robustos camaradas, también yo te amo a ti, como a cualquiera. I have written a lot of sonnets. I have 100 sonnets in a book, and this is another. La serie se llama Ya tengo la ilusión y la caída. Número 2. Quisiera recorrerte con mis manos, como un batir del corazón sonoro, como un terrible vendaval de asombro, como nombrar tus poros con mis labios. Pero en silencio guardo compostura, como quien limpia un vidrio varias veces para que al mundo luzca transparente sin parecer que ignora ni que duda, y correr y gritar a todo el mundo que quiero despertar con besos tuyos quebrándome el cristal que me reprime. Y es por gusto el batir, que grite o vuelva o me muestre dispuesto. A fin de cuentas, te escribo versos que de nada sirven. My latest book is called Songs for My Boys, Cantos para mis muchachos. This is the second edition. It's just a very classical Greek picture. The first one had this drawing by Alberto Escobar. It has two boys on bed. The drawing is called Censor or Banned because they took off the drawing from an exhibition in El Salvador because it was offensive. This book moves from different feelings like irony, some funny things, death and murder. I want to show you some different things. The whole book came with this poem, short poem. Corres, Esteban, dándome armonías a los ojos. Si yo el sudor que brota fuera en tu piel que juega la pelota, si tan solo jugaras con las mías. (23) Dulce es abrir en Afrodita flores de los muchachos en intensas poses, pero es amargo que al final te asombren y podrías prestarme $20. It happens. No faltará quien, al leer mis cantos, frunza el ceño juzgando con dureza por no hallar a Hebe, a Artemis o Atena, sino al guardián con su robusto falo desnudo entre las piernas. Con los mismos dedos que el miembro sobas, lee este libro. And this is one of the, let's say, most famous from this book. Tetis teje piedras con la arena, Los bordes le desgarran la piel blanda de los dedos, el pálido rostro perdido en los ojos del vacío, y los pies de plata mastican olas de purpurina y de su propia sangre. Hallaron los cabellos cortados en el lodo, rubio vellón a destajo trasquilado. 3 disparos en el tórax no bastaron, Ménades. Le rasgaron el vestido, las uñas le quebraron y los dedos. No saciaron, Ménades, con sangre el odio. No retuercen la calle y sangre escurre. Tetis se levanta gris entre las olas, abraza a las nereidas que han llegado y que le cantan, abraza los recuerdos que la queman, camina sola en la caliente arena, ruidosa cae al reclamar a Zeus. Hija de Tetis, pirra Aquilea de veloces pies, más rápido corrieron los disparos, más rápido caíste en la cera sorda, y tu sangre. Tetis desgarró su largo peplo, Peleo arrancó la tierra con sus dientes, Patroclo desgarró su amante corazón en 1000 astillas. Las Ménades dirán, matan hombre disfrazado de mujer. Las Ménades cantarán a su dios de odio. Aquilea de veloces pies, hermosa, no sabrán desgarrar la lucha diaria que has dejado. Verás que la sangre y purpurina generan más la lucha. Las manos diversas se levantan. And this is from my book, Y qué imposible no llamarte Ingle, and how impossible not to call you Brian. 12. Ilusión de geografía, espejismo de la sed anclada, vértigo distante y humo. Yo sé que brújula, imán, día, acento que alucina, puerta que más allá de la cordura, huésped que deshoja el paraíso, labio que amenaza con desorden en la quietud de mi costado. Delirio de vapor o espuma. Yo solo sé que sin permiso, dulce, atrevido, vas derritiéndome la escarcha en los latidos, vas cosechando en mi desierto el día, vas, exacto, esperado, completando el asombro de todas mis palabras. Quiero cerrar con este poema de los míos. Es el 29. Saber que vienen de gozarse juntos, por las chispas que salen de sus ojos, a nadie se le oculta, ni a Esquilo. Se leen los copiosos besos en ambos cuellos, muestran sus manos la indecorosa gloria de los muslos, olor del vicio en las mejillas suaves, destilan el deseo corrupto y consumado en cada paso, arrastran sus miembros desbaratados en lascivia, en la frente los sellos de ardor desmesurado y en la espalda el sudor con voz que los delata. A nadie se le oculta, ni a Esquilo, de dónde es que venimos esta noche. Y quiero cerrar con otro de los poetas que yo admiro mucho, es Constantinos Petru Kavafis, this Greek poet, and the poem is called Very Seldom. An old man used up, bent, clipped by time and indulgence, slowly walks along the narrow street. But when he goes inside his house to hide the shambles of his old age, his mind turns to the share in youth that still belongs to him. His verse is now quoted by young men. His visions come before their lively eyes. Their healthy, sensual minds their shapely bodies steered to the conception of the beautiful. Cavafis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alberto. Muchas gracias, Francisco, Leo, Alberto. This has been such a treat. Ha sido una maravilla. Let's go into the question portion. I'll start off with algunas preguntas. Vamos a estar entre idiomas. We're going to be in between English and Spanish. So please respond en cualquier idioma que estás más cómodo. So please respond in whatever language you're most comfortable in. And then feel free to drop questions in the chat, comments in the chat for our wonderful poets, and I'll make sure to get to them. But the first question I kind of wanted to ask is kind of, as you were able to read and listen to one another's work, what kind of similarities and divergences did you guys find in one another's work? Was there anything particular that y'all were noticing? There's definitely something in like Alberto and Francisco's voice that I feel like really resonates with one another that I'm still trying to pin down. But there's definitely a bunch of similarities there. So I don't know, Leo, Francisco, Alberto, if y'all have anything to say about that.
Well, when I was reading Leo's sampling, and I think the first poem he read today reminded me of it. There was that poem, the first poem in your sample, Leo. It reminded me of Herman Melville and Whitman. This idea of these sort of merchant marine sailors who are exhibiting sort of this outward straight masculinity, but underneath they have this other life going on. I'm not answering the question, I'm making an observation of something that I immediately caught and gravitated towards. I'm wondering if you could say something about that. You know the poem I'm talking about, the very first one. It was the name of a ship. It was the name of
it's really interesting because that poem is called SS General Belgrano, and it's the ship where my grandfather, sort of was waiting to be built in Liverpool. So he came here to the UK in the 50s, and apparently we know that he had a lover. So in my story, the lover is a male lover. So that's sort of my connection to him. And so I did a little bit of research, and so I recreated that meeting, that love affair between my grandfather and a lover. And it's a very long poem with kind of long lines. It's very narrative. But I love that, because we sort of, sometimes in our histories, in our families, we lack those stories that sometimes, that kind of, you know what I mean, that resonate with you. And for me, I wanted that affair to be a gay affair. It doesn't matter, you know what I mean? It's almost like this idea that you recreate history that belongs to you. In my imagination, he lived in Liverpool for 2 years and he was on his own. So why not? Why not?
I felt like I was reading the beginning of Moby Dick, those first few chapters of Moby Dick.
Yes. And my whole book is really all about ships and moving and departing. And so there's a lot of the visually, the idea of a ship is very important. Yes, that actually ties really well with Whitman, with Alberto's poem. And I think yours as well, because you had a poem in your selection that was after Whitman or
Well, I also want to mention about Alberto's work. When Alberto, when you were reading your sonnets, I was thinking of Neruda. I was also thinking of Francisco X. Alarcon with talking about the body parts, the ejército de dedos and muslos. And I was thinking of both Alarcon, but also Pablo Neruda's love sonnets. I thought they were beautiful.
Yeah, it's interesting because the names of the mentors, Cavafy, Francisco Alarcon, Thomas Gunn, all of them, they are also mentors to me. So it's interesting that our mentors are actually, this community that we belong to. There is a link as well through the mentors, to the people who actually we read, Cavafy and Gunn and Alarcon and you. And, you know, there's this kind of thread that connects us and our poems and poetry. And I really like the idea, Francisco, that you mentioned at the beginning, this idea that we are part of a bigger story. And that, you know, that the whole idea of reading poems from mentors. You know, I really love that, this idea that we belong to a community, that there's a wider community, that there's a history behind us, and it will continue. And that's a really beautiful and powerful thing. Yeah.
Alberto, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, I read both works from Francisco and Leo, and I felt identified with some of the poems more. With Leo, maybe the family background, you know, with all this idea of machismo and they push you to this side and know where you belong. And with Francisco, I felt very touched with the poems, with the recreation poem by Darío, Rubén Darío. And I was thinking that I was like looking for information about when Darío came to El Salvador when he was like 15 years old. The first time he went out of Nicaragua, he came to El Salvador. And the last country he was in before he died was El Salvador. But when he was here, being a teenager, I have heard, don't believe me, that he was like sin control, uncontrolled, like doing with lovers. I don't know. They say that most girls, but I think that for also boys. That's my theory, but I want to research about. I haven't found any book that talks about that in detail. So let's say we have a reference in common, maybe from Latin area or from English, like Whitman, for example, or Cavafis. In my case, I love him. And those and they give us some steps to be brave and say it. In my case, these books, Cantos, it is like said, like the openly gay book, even though I have talked about the topic in all of my books. But this is like the only book say like it refers completely about the gay topic. It has sold out the 2 editions, and it's not only for gay people or LGBT groups. I have been with them, but not only with them. The book has been received by whoever wants to read, and that's something I am happy with.
That's great. Has it been translated into English?
No.
We'll have to get it translated.
We will. So many exciting things right now. I'm going to jump to a question to Francisco, which is about your Darío translations. Which is like, where did you make the decision to start translating them in your like specific idiosyncratic style? Is there a larger selection of Darío translations you got in like a cabinet somewhere, or will you eventually translate a whole collection? And how did you choose the poems which you chose? Just because he has such a vast body of work, so like the selection there is a huge decision-making project that I'm just curious about.
Well, let me tell the story of the poem I read today. So that poem, Winter Hours, pre-2012, and I'll tell you in a minute why 2012 is such an important year. Pre-2012, Winter Hours went, look at her. So the original Spanish poem talks about a Carolina. Carolina is the beloved in that sonnet, which is from his book Azul. And so it was sort of a liberal version riff. And the pre-2012 version was Look at Her, et cetera, et cetera. So in 2012, Arizona State University acquired a private archive of Darío papers, and it was spearheaded by a scholar, a Darío scholar named Alberto Acereda. And apparently Darío late in life had the custom, anytime he wrote a letter and sent it off, he would write a copy of that letter for his own files. So in that archive that was acquired by ASU, Alberto Acereda discovered 9 letters addressed to Amado Nervo. And those 9 letters made it very clear that they'd been having an affair in secret, and they shared an apartment in Paris for 9 months in 1900. And Alberto Acereda wrote a very substantive piece of scholarship analyzing those letters. And I found out about this in 2012, and it just completely changed all these. I'd done a handful of Darío translations, including De Invierno. And so I just decided, sort of the way Leo decided to imagine his grandfather having this male lover, I just decided on the strength of Alberto Acereda's scholarship, I basically decided to queer that sonnet. And by then, I had a handful of translations, I say translations in quotes, of Darío's, and a few of them, I just began to sort of tinker with them in light of this new information. Another poem of his, Yo persigo una forma, I decided to change the Venus into David, the David of Florence. I decided to make the goddess into a god. And so in terms of a larger project, I think at some point, I don't have any method. I have those 10 poems in After Rubén, that's basically it. But at some point, I do want to go back. I'm very attracted to this idea of using a Darío text as a springboard to write a poem in English. And where I see opportunities to have a little more freedom, like I do with this sonnet that I read today, then I'll do that. But I don't have any particular preset agenda. I just like the idea of taking one text as material to write a poem in English.
I love how organic that process is. This next question is going to be for Alberto and Leo, where in your selections, Greek myths seem to be like part of your obsessions. And I was wondering if you could talk about why you're drawn to them and how you're seeking to reinterpret them or to bring them to a contemporary audience.
In my case, more than the Greek, I'm fascinated by the Latin poets, by Ovid, by Horace, by Virgil. And I'm fascinated by the myths in general, and by translations and what I call mistranslations. So I do translate poetry from Latin America to English, and I mistranslate the classics, the Latin poets. I've got poems by Ovid and sections from the Metamorphoses, and I'm just fascinated by this idea of when you translate what you get and what is missed out and what's left out. And as a general concept, as a journalist, I translate all the time. I translate what's happening here in the UK to South America. I translate the concept and the ideas, and I try to make sense of what's happening to other audiences. So this process, I'm just fascinated by this. The classics, Latin poetry, I read it mostly in Spanish, and I was always fascinated by them, especially Ovid, and especially the Metamorphoses, mostly because of these changes, these physical changes that happen, and they're so beautiful, and they're so poetic, and they're so meaningful to me. So there's a lot of changes and metamorphoses in the poems that I write. One of those is Echo. But I'm really curious to hear what Alberto has to say about because the book, tu libro, tiene mucho de estos poetas, ¿no?
Sí, en mi caso tengo 2 libros que se basan en las historias o en las fábulas griegas, pero no solo recrear o citarlas o volverlas a decir, más bien, como comentaba Willy, es como darle una nueva escenario, ¿no? Al personaje. Por ejemplo, como en el que leí de la pirra Aquilea, ¿no? Es el Aquiles, el feroz Aquiles, que va a la guerra contra los troyanos, pero que según las fábulas de los griegos, antes de irse a la guerra, sus padres tienen miedo de que vaya a morir, porque saben que si va a la guerra va a morir. Entonces, ellos lo ocultan en una escuela como una especie de academia, pero de muchachas, de mujeres, y vive travestido, ¿no? Vive como una mujer para que no lo encuentren y lo lleven a la guerra. Entonces, yo tomo a este personaje, al Aquiles travestido, huyendo de la muerte, ¿no? Y lo pongo en una esquina de ciudad de San Salvador, no sé, Guatemala, donde es crimen, ¿no? Ser gay y cosas así. Y lo que sucede es que lo matan, ¿no? En el poema lo matan también, porque el odio, ¿no? Es un crimen de odio, y el poema sobre eso habla. Entonces, como agarrar el personaje de los que habla Homero o los que hablan Hesíodo u otros autores y cambiarlos de casa, ¿no? A ver qué les pasa en esa casa, ¿no? A ver cómo reaccionan. Cómo reacciona, por ejemplo, Medea en San Salvador, ¿no? Con este contexto nuestro violento y cada día, el día por día se va luchando. Entonces, sería la misma, por ejemplo, Helena de Troya, ¿no? O qué significa Helena de Troya, ¿no? Como símbolo, como premio, como trofeo casi, ¿no? Entonces, es como agarrar estos mitos y en mi caso sí han sido de mucha influencia. Y en los cantos para los muchachos, lo que sucede es que en muchos de ellos solamente hago como hace Francisco Aragón en sus poemas, en lugar de decir el abrazo imposible de la Venus de Milo, ¿no? Dice abrazado por David, ¿no? Entonces, que me encanta esa idea. Entonces, yo, en lugar de decir Willy con Miguel, ¿verdad? Le digo, sé mi Jacinto y yo seré tu Apolo. No solo como agarrar esa excusa, la excusa de los nombres o de las fábulas griegas para recrear mi propia poema, ¿no? Y en muchos casos, para un lector, digamos, estándar o común, no requiere conocer quién era Hilas o quién era Hércules, quién era, I don't know, ¿no? Sino que pienso yo, el poema mismo le da el contexto, es decir, aunque no sepa quién es Jacinto ni quién es Apolo, pero lo que el poema dice se lo va a expresar. Entonces, es como la excusa griega, digamos, me lleva a recrear mis propios contextos.
En mi caso yo diría que yo hago tal vez algo parecido, pero de la forma inversa. Por ejemplo, tengo un poema que va a estar en el libro que se llama Barco de Inmigrantes y lo que hace es utilizar la historia homérica de este viaje como un poco épico. No menciono ningún nombre griego, son todos personajes de mi familia o de mi historia. O sea, vacío de nombres y lo que uso es la historia que es como eterna o tiene una historia muy larga y la hago mía, y la hago presente, y la hago actual, digamos. Pero sí, es similar. Sí, sí.
Qué respuestas más emocionantes. Like, this has my brain like going in so many different directions. Pero I think the question I kind of want to skip to right now, it's kind of on the same track. Alberto and Francisco, you both referenced Walt Whitman, and we talked a little bit about this, but what drives you to him as a poet? That was one of the references that caught me most off guard. I was like, I don't know, maybe I just need to get more into Whitman, but I just was curious, like, what drove y'all to him? What y'all found, like, emocionante about him?
Well, in my case, at least what I think you were looking at, it was just Darío wrote a sonnet titled Walt Whitman, and I decided to just try to write a version of that sonnet. But I guess I would say Walt Whitman, getting back to what Leo was saying earlier, that we're all part of this lineage. I mean, Garcia Lorca has his Oda at Walt Whitman. I think he's our grandparent. He's our great grandparent of all of us, and I think he's inescapable. I think we can't I'm not sure. I mean, I had to read him in high school a little bit, but I guess I've become interested in him more through figures like Darío, through figures like Lorca. I've become interested also, getting back to this idea of works of art that are, like there was an opera that was produced somewhere in the Northeast a couple of years ago on one episode of Whitman's life where he was being tended to by this male nurse, and this opera composer took that little snippet of a story and made a whole opera out of it.
Whoa.
Based on this little relationship that he had with this male nurse who was looking after him in old age. So I just think he's a gigantic figure that's unavoidable. That's my take. What about you, Alberto?
Yeah, I think like he's like a grandfather that you admire, and you have heard all the things he did, and you are able to read by his own hand, what he wrote. And it was he was one of the first poet I get attached to, and I have even been on TV talking about him. And the poem I dedicate to him is about love, not love anyone else. Love anyone, not only Whitman. I love you like I love anyone else. Ese es como el mensaje que me deja Whitman, ¿no? Entonces, sí, me amo, ¿no? Mi cuerpo y todo, pero también amo a otro, pero no solo ese otro, sino que amo todo, ¿no? Amo todo lo que hay. I love you, but I love all the world.
Wow. And Francisco, I love that idea of like accessing Whitman through other poets primarily. It's like the work of reinterpretation there. There's something really meaty there that I'm still processing. We've talked about the question I'm going to jump to, because I feel like we've been talking about kind of the poets that have served as role models, is what questions and concerns do you grapple with when you represent queerness in your poems, and how do you try to represent your queernesses and like stuff like that? Just because that's always a fraught question of, how to represent a group that's always being marginalized, that's always being misrepresented. So what sort of issues do you grapple with? What sort of things would you like younger writers to know?
I did an event a few months ago with the young Honduran-born poet Roy Guzman. And one of the things I came away with from that event is that this question will depend on what generation you belong to. I know for myself, this is part, for myself, it's just the idea of trying to be as transparent and honest as possible, and to fight against tendencies that try to erase us. For example, the whole project with Darío, I talk about this in the essay. I was having lunch a number of years ago with a Nicaraguan poet who lives in the Washington, D.C. area. And this story of Darío and Amado Nervo came up during the course of our conversation. And this individual made the comment, oh, that Darío Nervo story is just an effort to ensuciar su nombre, to soil his name. And I was taken aback by her use of that verb, ensuciar. And so that just made me more intent on amplifying this project. So for me, it's just the idea of being present and being unapologetic and transparent, and not being, fighting against being silenced or being erased. Now, someone of a younger generation who's 20 or 30 years younger might be past that. Their queer project is completely different and more contemporary in some ways. Someone like Roy Guzman. So I guess it depends on where you're coming from. I don't think there's any one size fits all when it comes to this question. For me, it's just a matter of survival and visibility and not being erased. There's a DC poet named Dan Vera who has this wonderful poet called To the Executors of Some Gay Writers. And it's like this curse poem where he's cursing those people who are trying to straighten the record or erase the record of anyone who might have been might have been queer. And that's sort of where I see myself in that regard.
I mean, in my case, I would just, I agree with all what you said, Francisco. And also, for me, it's about sort of writing it and discovering it in my own history. And as you know, the things I was saying about my grandfather, I've got other poems about my grandfather, sort of looking at the picture and sort of judging my sexuality. And then suddenly I realized that he had a past, and you know what I mean, reimagining this history that is my own and that I belong to that, and I'm part of that. There's a lot of family, there's a lot of yeah, transparency, I guess. I agree with Francisco in that, and yes, it's interesting because while I was searching for my poems are overtly queer, or that I touch on things like love or relationships. I write a lot about my relationship with my partner. I've been with him for over 20 years now, and there is this sense that we are a family, that we created this family and this world, and it's very balanced to me. It's very sort of it gives me a lot to think about when I write. And so yeah, family in this kind of this new family that I created, and I'm really interested in that new chapter, I would say. Yeah.
Bueno, en mi caso no, creo que no considero así tanto lo externo. Es decir, escribo y digo, bueno, quizás en mis libros es más la parte gay, ¿no? Como hombre gay. Aunque hay poemas sobre, digamos, sobre lesbianas o el amor entre mujeres, o también algunos sobre la T, ¿no? El transgénero, pero la mayor parte de poemas es sobre la vivencia como hombre gay. Y quizá no, en muy pocos poemas reflejo, digamos lo negativo, la parte, porque o no, en mi caso no ha sido de sufrimiento, digamos, ni de estigma, ni de discriminación, ni de familia, ¿verdad? Aunque no lo digan, pues sabe que está ahí el amor y nunca pues han juzgado mal ni nada por el estilo. Entonces, quizás de la parte de discriminación sería por la vivencia con otros compañeros, ¿no? O con la otra persona, o recoger testimonios sobre las personas que sí han sufrido. Y lo que muestro sobre cómo hablar del tema, pues lo hago abiertamente y leo, por ejemplo, estos poemas en muchos públicos, desde jóvenes, adultos, en las escuelas públicas, por ejemplo, en universidades. Cuando se presentó el libro de los cantos para mis muchachos en Tegucigalpa, en Honduras, por ejemplo, el evento tuvo miles de comentarios, quizá 50-50. Unos decían que cómo era posible que fuera la universidad a permitir la inmoralidad y el pecado en su recinto universitario. Es decir, ¿cómo van a hablar de ese tema que no es bíblico y que Dios castiga, ¿no? Pero la otra mitad de comentarios y de reacciones era lo contrario, ¿no? Qué bueno que por fin la universidad está hablando del tema. ¿Sí? En Honduras, ¿no? Y es parecido en El Salvador el caso, ¿no? Y quizá en la región. Y en ese aspecto, es decir, plantarse y leer, la sala se llenó, obviamente la sala estuvo llena de personas, el libro se vendió, quedaron en la universidad también, pero sí, yo esperaba que alguien se levantara y hiciera alguna pregunta, ¿no? Como en contra, o hiciera, como decía, alguna... Pero no, nadie dijo nada, eso estuvo bien. Entonces fue como también es en la forma en que se abordan los temas. Es decir, mi caso, la confrontación, es decir, confrontar al público es desde los temas, desde los poemas y la forma en que lo digo. Es decir, no solamente por espectáculo, digamos, sino que más bien son vivencias o es amor, ¿no? Lo que se está mostrando, y creo que eso es lo que conecta con cualquier público, mujeres, hombres, no importa.
Such great responses. Oh my gosh. I have one more question I'm going to ask, and please feel free to drop questions in the chat if y'all still have more questions. I just wanted to give y'all an opportunity to talk about any other LGBTQ plus poets who have served as your role models for your literary work. So yes, kind of doing the same work that we've been doing all this session, really, of just calling back to kind of the family that like helps make this work possible. So if there's anybody else that wanted to talk about that, Leo, Francisco, and Alberto. And then we have a question from Fanny afterwards, but I'll let y'all tackle that question first. Yeah?
I'll just briefly say, you know, being from the San Francisco Bay Area, I was in deciding who I was going to read, I could have easily have read a poem by Jack Spicer or by Robert Duncan, who are poets who are affiliated with the Bay Area. And of course, a lot of my contemporaries, Rigoberto Gonzalez, Eduardo C. Corral, but I'll leave it at that.
For me, apart from Ailson, Jorge Eduardo Ailson, there's Manuel Puig and Garcia Lorca, and Hermes Villordo and Copy. These Argentinian writers who formed me when I read them when I was a teenager, and they were very important to me. And they're not very well known. Neto Palonger perhaps a little bit more, but I owe them a great deal. Some of them are poets and some are fiction writers like Villordo or Copy. So yes.
And that's part of the reason why I asked this question, is because this is like me figuring out like where to get those other recs and for people to be able to like lob on to the voices that have been able to like form y'all. Like even the San Francisco poets that Francisco was mentioning, like I was unaware of them. So I'm going to be looking more into them. Alberto, was there anything that you were wanting to add? Algo que querías agregar?
Algunos autores, ¿verdad? Como gustaba el de acá, pero Lindo sería uno de los principales poetas, aunque ya falleció, pero es contemporáneo. También el novelista Mauricio Orellana Suárez, que es muy importante en la región de Centroamérica, hablando con novelas o cuentos sobre el tema LGBT, muy fuerte y muy necesario. Por ejemplo, también está Manuel Soc, de Guatemala, que fue muy transgresor, ¿no? Con su poesía queer y todo. Entonces, también que fue muy interesante la postura, digamos. Es muy distinto a lo mío, ¿no? Pero sí me gusta la forma en que él lo muestra. Tenemos su queerness, ¿no? Entonces, quizás por ahí algunos autores que podemos nombrar. También está, por ejemplo, Nadie en El Salvador.
Nadie.
Javier Ramírez. También está Alejandro Córdoba, un narrador sobre todo, también excelente.
Buen amigo Alejandro. He's really good. Está en Argentina right now? Isn't he in like Buenos Aires or something doing an MFA? He's really good. Thank you all for that list of poets and like authors I'm just going to be able to research and like indulge in. Fanny, turn on your mic and then let's ask this question.
Gracias a todos. This is just a window of opportunity for me to learn more. Just in our book club here in Salt Lake City, we read a book that eventually turns into this subject, and it was interesting to see the reaction to many of the people that, you know, the mixed, as Alberto says, the mixed opinions, right? But I think it's a great opportunity to bring awareness. My question is to how can you be advocates for the current situation we're living in the United States? And I think worldwide, but the United States, just in my neighborhood, I follow this page where pride flags disappeared in the neighborhood. And this makes me really upset, because who takes the time and effort to do something that it's definitely part of our society? And we all should be advocates for this terrible, to defend the rights, right? And then the other thing is that I'm Mexican. I come from a very conservative family, and even in my own family, when this subject raises, I hear comments of my own family, like pointing at, ay, eres gay, o eres maricón, o eres puto, ¿no? Estas expresiones tan dolorosas, ¿sí? ¿Cómo hacemos? ¿Qué hacen ustedes para defender los derechos desde nuestro lenguaje, ¿no? Como latinoamericanos, y hacerles saber a nuestras sociedades, a nuestra población, que seres humanos, ¿no? Y es algo que a mí personalmente me duele mucho. Tengo muchas amistades y que pertenecen a este grupo y que se aíslan precisamente por este lenguaje tan doloroso de sus propias familias. Entonces, ¿cómo hacemos nosotros como miembros de una sociedad artística para hacer conocer estos derechos de niños, ¿no?
En mi caso, te respondo directamente. La segunda parte me pareció muy interesante, porque en mi trabajo, en muchos de mis poemas, yo hablo de eso, por ejemplo, en una cena familiar donde hay un ataque que es supuestamente menor, alguien dice una palabra que es ofensiva, y como el lenguaje, que para muchos puede ser simplemente una palabra, nada, como que no tiene importancia, para otros puede ser no solamente agresiva y muy dolorosa, sino que genera un estigma muy grande. Y como darle mucho énfasis en el poder de las palabras, nosotros que somos poetas, escritores, en la importancia de eso, y también en la importancia de esta cosa casual, de agresión, de microagresión que ocurre en las familias. Lo digo personalmente, en una familia donde era muy religioso, y donde, por eso en ese poema de la ceremonia familiar, donde se termina con ese rezo, donde parece que está todo bien, pero no está todo bien, donde la religión impone ciertas cosas, hago como hincapié mucho en el uso del lenguaje y en el uso de estas palabras que estigmatizan mucho, y cuánta importancia hay que darles, me parece. Siempre escribo desde ese lugar, ¿no? Como desde el lugar, como ponerlo sobre la mesa y decir, esto es lo que viví, y esto todavía sigo recordando esa palabra, esa única palabra que se dijo en esa cena. Bueno.
Muchas gracias.
I'll add to that. Every fall semester, I teach a course here at Notre Dame on Latinx poetry. And most of my students are non-English majors. Many of them are student athletes. A lot of them are business majors. And I've been very heartened in that in my syllabus, I teach openly gay writers. The material is very gay. And thankfully, up until now, I find college age kids today are just, they're doesn't cause any, they write about it. I taught this poet named Paul Martinez Pompa, and he has a poem in his book called Edwin Sucks Dick. And a number of my students chose that poem to write about. I didn't tell them to write about that poem. So I actually feel a little hopeful, at least among college age kids, that I bring this material into the classroom, we discuss it, and they are just completely nonplussed about it. It doesn't even, I imagine it would have been different maybe 30 years ago or 20 years ago, but at least today, bringing this material in the classroom, that's how I try to normalize it in the classroom, by bringing it in the classroom.
Great. Yeah, that's great.
Bueno, ya comentaba un poco sobre eso de acceder con las temáticas a todos los niveles, ¿no? Y que se hable según acorde también con las edades, no hablar tanto con niños pequeños, pero sí que se vaya acercando ese tema y que ya esté presente. porque yo también soy maestro de escuela con todos los grados desde 7 años hasta 15 o más. Y siempre en los grupos hay niños o niñas, ¿no? que se les nota, digamos, y que se burlan de ellos. Entonces, también hacer como maestros, también de ser capaces de integración, de la integración y que sean parte de eso. Porque, por ejemplo, la maestra de cual yo llegaba a enseñarles como mi clase, ¿no? Y me iba, ¿no? Pero estaban con su maestra todo la tarde completa, ¿no? Todo el día. Pero decía ella, yo no quiero niñas, le decía, niñas como insulto, digamos, ¿no? Hacia un varón. Usted es varón, usted es niño, no sea niña. Entonces, yo llegaba con otra mentalidad de decir, no, expresate, no sé, hablar, contanos, ¿no? O que sea parte normal, ¿no? De la clase sin ninguna distinción o preferencia de ningún tipo. Y ya pues cuando es posible ya se puede igual llevar, como decía Francisco, llevar poemas, ¿no? En todo esto, ¿no? Contexto, según lo que se pueda. Bueno, en mi caso es de matemática, no álgebra, pero podría darse también, ¿no? Integrar esos temas, ¿no? A la matemática, a sociales, a la ciencia, ¿no? Porque son parte normal y cotidiana de todos los ámbitos. Incluso con la religión, ¿no? También he sido parte de un grupo en una iglesia que tiene este grupo para personas LGBT, donde se estudian temáticas de derechos humanos, ¿no? Derechos humanos, también religión, pero desde otra perspectiva, no la que te castiga o el Dios que te quema, ¿verdad? Sino más bien también porque, como decían compañeros, gran parte de la culpa que se crea en las personas LGBT viene a partir de la religión. Y que ya sea evangélica, cristiana, católica o cualquier religión casi que condena y te manda al infierno, solo por ser, ¿verdad?, LGBT. Pero también verlo desde otra perspectiva donde eso es infundado, es decir, eso no tiene fundamento ni bíblico casi para poder juzgar o para poder, es decir, como trabajar desde el área de el derecho humano, ¿no? Desde la religión también, de construir y volver a crear otro fundamento. Y también desde la parte educativa, ¿no? Que lo integra todo, de verlo como algo normal y casi que tan aburrido como el amor entre heteros, ¿verdad? Es como creen que es algo prohibido y algo que es muy distinto, ¿no? Y cuando descubran que es igual de aburrido e igual de que el amor hetero, pues se acabó el chiste, ¿no?
And I will add something else, that is that in terms of activism, I would say that just by writing poetry, by writing these books, we are actually making a difference. I mean, in my case, when I was a teenager growing up and trying to find out about my sexuality, it was actually through poetry, through these poets, through these books that I found a voice, and I immediately became aware of these issues. So for me, just the fact that we can actually write poetry, this poetry, and this with these issues is in itself, you know, an act of activism.